This incredibly delicious tart is called Infinitely Dark for a reason. It has a deep, intense, buttery chocolate ganache that sits atop a thick, tender, and crisp chocolate sablé crust, with just the right amount of sea salt. Today I'm guiding you step by step through legendary French chef Pierre Hermé's Infinitely Dark Chocolate Tart. I've translated his original French video, thoroughly tested the recipe, and captured all the detail and more so you can enjoy it too. Hello, this is Chef Zach Townsend with Dallas Chocolate Classes in Dallas, Texas. I'm also the French to English translator of 19 cookbooks. I'm very excited about the video and recipe I'm sharing with you today. This is from the global pastry icon Pierre Hermé. He's a legend and very well respected worldwide. Pierre was head pastry chef at La Durée in Paris, as well as Fauchon, and is credited with the global popularity of the Parisian macaron. He now runs his own empire of pastry and chocolate shops across the world, and he has written many books, appeared on TV, etc. Most pastry chefs today who follow French pastry aspire to be the next Pierre Hermé. I had the honor of being the translator of his book, Pierre Hermé, The Ultimate Recipes from the Master Patissier, in 2014. It's a beautiful book with amazing photography and is very aspirational. I'll put a link for it in the description. His video I'm featuring today was recorded as a simple home video and features Pierre and his wife Valerie in their home kitchen, with Valerie interviewing him while he takes the viewers through the steps for his amazing chocolate tart he calls his Infinitely Dark Chocolate Tart with sea salt sablé crust. The video was uploaded to a French channel about 5 years ago. Through all my testing to get his recipe translated and adapted to share with you, this became my favorite chocolate tart, and I'm confident that you're going to love it too. Let's get started. So this recipe has two components to it, the chocolate sea salt sablé crust and the dark chocolate ganache filling at 70% cacao. As always, plan everything ahead, measure everything out so that you can be more organized. Now the method for his sablé crust is not included in his tart video, but what I realized is that this crust is actually his sea salt sablé cookie dough at 2/3 its original quantities, which he makes in a separate video. So he's using his sablé cookie dough as the base for this tart. So I've had to refer back to that video separately in order to show you his particular method for it. So the ingredients are the butter, and it's preferable to use a European style butter here, but an 80% sweet cream butter works great too. The turbinado sugar, he mentions that you can also use coconut sugar if you prefer. The cocoa powder, salt, and flour combined. The vanilla extract, which he mentions is optional, but I prefer it. He states that the vanilla is just a seasoning. The baking soda, the granulated sugar, and the chopped chocolate. Now the chocolate that he prefers for this tart crust and the filling is the Valrhona Guanaja 70% cacao, and I tested it with that chocolate versus the Guitar 63%, and hands down I prefer the Guanaja for its intensity and amazing flavor. You can use any chocolate you prefer, but the chocolate you choose will set the character and tone of the tart. I really do recommend the Guanaja in this case. The butter is cut up into large pieces and placed inside of the food processor. The cocoa powder and flour are sifted together. Now cocoa powder is always lumpy and machines will not remove the lumps. So always be sure to sift the cocoa powder before incorporating it into any recipe. And you can see the lumps there that he's pushing through the sifter. So he processes the butter until it's smooth and creamy, and he mentions that the butter should be the consistency of an ointment, meaning just thick and creamy, what the French call in their recipes pommade, like a pomade, but without being melted in any way. Next he adds the baking soda, the granulated sugar, the salt. I mentioned earlier the salt was actually in the cocoa powder, and flour, but he actually added it separately, the turbinado sugar, and then the vanilla extract. These ingredients are then incorporated until creamy, and it will remain a little grainy due to the sugar. So next he picks up the parchment paper and he incorporates the flour cocoa mixture all at once and processes that just until the dry ingredients are incorporated. Now he emphasizes that it's very important not to over process this, only go just long enough that the dry ingredients mostly disappear. And finally, he incorporates the chopped chocolate pieces by just a few quick pulses of the machine. It's very important not to process this too long to minimize gluten development. So there you have a crumbly dough, and these large crumbly pieces are what you want to ensure that you haven't over processed it. So you can see how crumbly and loose the dough is. Everything is incorporated, but with the dough left loose. Now, in order to be able to handle the dough, he finishes it by kneading it briefly by hand to ensure that it comes together as a single homogeneous mass. So there you have the food processor method. Now the stand mixer method is essentially the same approach. I put these instructions on screen so you could pause it to review them, but I suggest adding the flour and cocoa in 2 portions to make it easier to incorporate. Now the dough is rolled out immediately. It does not need to be chilled first. In fact, there is a note in the video from Pierre that states to ensure the dough is at room temperature before baking it to ensure even baking, and that the baked dough should appear slightly underbaked so that when it's finally refrigerated to set, the crust doesn't become too dry. The work surface is lightly dusted with flour and the dough is rolled out. Now the pieces of chocolate can make it a challenge to roll out, but if you have any small tears in the dough, just gently patch them together. Pierre states to leave the dough somewhat thick because this crust will be softer than a normal tart crust and easier to cut through. It also has a nice chocolatey sweetness, and the texture is a great contrast to the creamy ganache, so you want to ensure a good amount of crust with each bite. Roll it out to about 6 millimeters thick and around 23 centimeters in diameter, and keep in mind also that the dough will rise somewhat due to the baking soda. So to bake this, you have a couple of options. I tested the recipe by baking it in a traditional tart pan, as you see Pierre doing on screen here, but one with a removable bottom, because you want to be able to remove the tart from the pan once it's completed. I also tested it in a flan ring, and in his video, Pierre demonstrates both. The dimensions of the tart pan or the ring I used was 22 centimeters by at least 3 centimeters high, because remember, you also have to fill the pan with the ganache once the crust is baked, so you need to ensure there is room for the filling. If you decide to use a flan ring, the dough will be transferred to a baking sheet and the ring placed over it, as you see in these images. Pierre is demonstrating on screen how to line a traditional tart pan. You do want to be very careful when moving the dough, as the dough is very delicate once it's rolled out, so it can tear easily. My preference for moving it was to use a large cake spatula to slide under it and slide it into the pan or onto the baking sheet. So you see here that Pierre is trimming the dough away from the sides, and you can see that he's delicately patching any holes caused by the chocolate pieces. He's also patching gaps along the sides using excess dough. This ensures the ganache filling stays contained on top of the crust. So the crust gets baked at 170 degrees Celsius for about 11 minutes. It will have a moist, shiny appearance to it and be very soft. Here's some images for you in both the ring and the tart pan after it's baked to give you an idea of the appearance. So set the crust aside and let it cool completely before adding the chocolate filling. So the filling is simple, but here we are working with a ganache. And if you remember from my other videos, the definition of a ganache is an emulsion of chocolate with a liquid, most often cream. Because it's an emulsion, you have to get the balance of the liquid and chocolate correct, so that your mixture is smooth and creamy and is the correct consistency for what you are using the ganache for. Be sure to check out my ganache videos for more details on understanding ganaches better. So for the ingredients we have unsalted butter, heavy whipping cream, and finally the chocolate. As I mentioned previously, Pierre formulated his recipe for the Valrhona Guanaja 70% cacao. I love this tart with the Guanaja, so I encourage you to try that one. You can experiment with different chocolates, but the flavors, textures, and shade of color of your filling will change depending on the chocolate you choose. So the chocolate is partially melted. The cream is warmed only. There's no reason to bring it to boiling because the chocolate is already melted. And you introduce about 1/3 of the cream into the melted chocolate and begin stirring somewhat vigorously in the center to begin the emulsion. In the video, Pierre compares this to making a mayonnaise, which of course is also an emulsion. Now at this point, the ganache may seem very thick and elastic and possibly grainy, but that's normal until all of the liquid has been added. So the next portion of cream is added, which is about half of what's remaining, and that is also incorporated, at which point the ganache is now shiny in appearance, and then finally the final amount of cream is added. I'll let you watch his process here. So the ganache is now emulsified, and when its temperature is between 45 and 50 degrees Celsius, which Pierre suggests, then the butter is added and fully incorporated. Now, as you can see, and as he states, the ganache is silky and smooth. However, there is a way to make it even more perfect, and that's to take an immersion blender and blend it. It's an optional step if your ganache is already very well emulsified, but if you do this step, you'll see that your ganache becomes even more silky. The ganache, while still warm and fluid, is poured over the cooled Sablé crust. Now at some point in the video, Pierre mentions that you could have spread a praline onto this base prior to pouring the chocolate over it, but he states that he's making this tart very straightforward in this case, and this tart really doesn't need any embellishments, in my opinion, because it's delicious exactly as he's doing it. Now another important point I want to make here is you see that his ganache is self-leveling. In other words, when he poured it over the crust, the consistency of the ganache was perfect so that it smoothed out automatically, and this is what you want to achieve for the most attractive looking tart. So if, when you make this, your ganache is not self-leveling, either warm it up slightly to achieve that, or it could be that your consistency overall is not correct, and you may next time have to add a little more liquid to get the consistency correct depending on the chocolate that you chose. The tart is now removed from the ring or the pan. Take a paring knife or a small offset spatula and carefully run it around the edges. If you use the tart pan, it's a little bit more difficult because of the fluted edges, but it still unmolds fairly easily. And finally, for decoration, he places shards of chocolate on top. If you want to see an easy way to temper chocolate into shiny pieces, watch my video here and just leave the poly sheets flat rather than rolling them up. Then break them into large pieces. You can also just shave chocolate on top or sprinkle the top with cocoa nibs. I do want to make one final recommendation here regarding my experience with this tart. Due to the smooth surface of the crust, I found that the ganache, when it's at a slightly chilled temperature, can separate from the crust. I solved that by randomly poking holes into the crust prior to pouring the ganache over it. This allows for a little bit better adhesion between the ganache and the crust, but is an optional step if you run into that problem too. So the tart is completed. The thick, tender texture of the crust with that perfect hit of salt and sitting underneath the super silky ganache makes for a very memorable chocolate tart, and one I'm sure will be one of your favorites too. So I hope you enjoy the recipe and that you learned something new. Thanks for watching. The easiest way to support my channel is to simply hit the like button or leave a comment. You can now also support my work to bring you proven new recipes and informative content by joining my Patreon page, where you'll now find different tiers for exclusive perks. This will help support the work that I do for you here and is greatly appreciated. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next video.